Oh, okay, brilliant. Okay, so today we're going to be talking to Jo Hemmings. She's joining us to discuss mental health for women in the criminal justice system in the UK, but also what brings them there in the first place and how it comes post-release. So, Jo, thank you so much for joining us. And could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and about your background?
So, as I say, I'm a behavioural psychologist, which is really another word for psychologist, really. But obviously, my emphasis is on people's behaviour. I specialise in really in relationship counselling, dating coaching, and anxiety. I've been very hard, working during the pandemic. Obviously, I've been working with frontline NHS staff, so there's been a lot of, huge increased levels of cortisol and adrenaline in people and fear. And so a lot of the time I've been spending sort of on the mental health of individuals who have had to face this pandemic, front on, really.
Absolutely. Well, I've been working, I'm a frontline in the sense that I'm working in mental health in schools. So I've been in school pretty much all the way through. But for people actually in hospitals, seeing the flip side, seeing the results of it all must be
tough. And even I, who think I'm a reasonably resilient person, but nevertheless a human being, has sometimes ended up, crying in a little ball at the end of the day, because we all have to have an outlet, really, for that.
And it's been quite a traumatizing year, hasn't it?
It's been a traumatizing year for a lot of people, without a shadow of a doubt. Hopefully we're on a better path now.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to be talking about women's mental health in prisons. So let's start with, what do we think? The first thing that we're always going to come up against, I think, in this conversation from certain arenas, if you like, is, well, they've ended up in prison. So, you've made your choice and that's where you are. So the sympathy levels aren't high in that sense. But let's talk a little bit about what might bring someone there in the first place. So what
I think
kind of background?
That's the point, really. So many people end up in prison because they already have mental health issues, something where they haven't been able to judge a situation wisely, or they've been absolutely overwhelmed and have sort of had a knee-jerk auto-response reaction to something. Or they've been very depressed and they don't know how to cope with it, and so they've turned to something else. It may be drug taking, it may be theft, whatever it is. These are people who already have mental health issues. So to go into a prison with that and then not get the immediate rehabilitative support that goes with that is very counterproductive, because what happens is, if they don't get that support, then those mental health issues, particularly in a prison environment, will simply tend to increase, and that's why we get, the chances of reoffending being so high. If they had the support that they needed, perhaps before they went into prison, they wouldn't have been in prison in the first place. But once they are in there, it's really very, very important that their experience in there is one, yes, punitive. Obviously, they're in prison, but at the same time, supportive in a psychological sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to move away from the idea that we're saying that mental health support in prison is somehow pandering to, or that they're not, that they are being punished. If your liberty is taken away, that is a punishment, isn't it?
One
a lot
of the
women.
Problems that I've spoken to a few prison officers recently, and I've talked to them about this, and they say one of the issues that they have, is that they're under-resourced as individuals and as a sort of industry, if you want to call it that, but as a sort of environment. And secondly, a lot of people will say, well, I've got this issue, that issue, and they don't have the time to sort out those that are looking for special treatment, that actually perhaps don't have a serious mental health issue as others, who are not as forthcoming about it. So because they're not trained in recognizing or have the time to work out who is perhaps, and there will be people who are saying they've got X, Y, and Z in order to get better treatment, better conditions, from those that really do need it. And so therefore it's almost like a blanket, when it's the boy who cried wolf syndrome. We're not going to listen to anybody. And that's a real issue, I think.
And so in terms of assessment, there needs to be a much more robust system, doesn't there, to really assess this kind of need ongoing throughout somebody's prison term.
Indeed.
So for example, somebody might come in presenting with depression or anxiety, but I think one of the issues that we're seeing is that a year, 2 years down the line, those issues might have become much more severe because they're essentially being re-traumatized then within the prison system. Indeed. In terms of,
well, they never had their trauma dealt with in the first.
They don't have their trauma dealt with, but then they sort of they are introduced to more trauma, so that they then have they're surrounded by other people with their own traumas. There might be self-harm going on, there might be suicide, there might be all kinds of
they're in a terrible
low-level violence going on.
From that respect. So a lot of what I do is psych assessments now for sort of TV shows, documentaries, reality shows, whatever it may be. It isn't that difficult to do an initial assessment. You would take into account someone's background, their history, what medications they've been on, who have they seen, if they had therapy, have they gone to their GP, etc., etc. Have they talked about their mental health issues in the past? So doing that all the time. So an initial assessment is perhaps key when people go first into the sort of prison environment, by somebody who is empathetic, impartial, and professional, who will actually say, look, yes, I genuinely do think, person A, given the history, given what she's told me, she in this case, this is the plan I think they should be on for their duration of their sentence. Because if you don't have that right at the beginning, then they probably will never really get fully diagnosed or get the customized supports that they will need as an individual.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about rehabilitation, even for the people, I suppose, who would say, well, they've committed a crime, so they end up in prison. If we're talking, purely from a financial perspective, it's not terrifically financially viable to have a criminal justice system where people enter, we're paying for them to be there for 2 years, but they come out with no better, but quite often worse outcomes than when they first went in. So that it's not financially working.
It's not working financially. It's not working in terms of mental health either. So look, prisons are not a playground. They are there to you're there to serve a punitive sentence, and we can never remove that situation. But there are activities, skills that you can learn in prison, things that you didn't know you had a talent for. These should all be encouraged, because what we want to do is, when people are released, is give them the best possible opportunity to lead a more fulfilling life and not reoffend. And I think that's absolutely key, and that works for everybody on every level, including the economics of the justice system. There's no interest for anyone, or enthusiasm or taste for people reoffending. So it works on every level for the individual, it works for the service. And so I feel that sort of thing is very important, because I think a lot of people, clearly you have a lot of time on your hands when you're serving a sentence, and there should be, again, part of a plan. What is it you might be interested in? What could you learn? There are skills, there are online courses, things that give people hope, because without hope
is huge.
Hope is huge.
Because if you think you're just going to be released into the same set of circumstances, the chances of reoffending are incredibly high, aren't they? But I think a lot of the women that, particularly as I've been reading around the subject, a lot of the women that have ended up in the criminal justice system, their histories are heartbreaking, really. And I've, in my sort of the work that I've done over the years, I started out working mentoring for care leavers. This is 16 to 24-year-olds, and rates of crime are quite high in people leaving the care system. And then I've been working for years now with children who have disordered backgrounds, you know, the drugs involved, there's domestic violence, alcohol issues, various things at play. And one of the things that I've always noticed, and I've always been very aware of, is that when we're looking at those children, it's easy for people to sympathise with children and empathise with children. So if there's a child acting out, but you know there's an issue at home, people are much more understanding of
than they are with adults.
That's why they act the way they are.
Indeed.
And when you then meet adults, the parents of these children, they're quite often angry, antagonistic. They've got in their heads that you're going to be judgmental, that you're not on their side, and they present as quite unlikable a lot of the time. But what I've always tried to keep in mind is 20 years ago, that adult was that child.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And nobody helped and nobody supported in the right way then. And now what we've got is this adult who's
very frustrated.
The cycle again. And it is very frustrating.
Whether they're conscious of it or not, that's the way they are. And that's probably a tinderbox to offend. You know, it's just, you've got to take it out somehow, and you'll take it out possibly by offending in some way. A lot of these women have had abusive relationships. You know, is that taken into account? They need some escape. And even for children, you know, I'm just doing an ITV documentary at the moment, or working with families going through the CAM system, which was dreadful before the pandemic. And now, you know, kids who seriously need help are being rejected. They're being referred, but they're being rejected because there's
I regularly refer and I'm regularly rejected.
Okay. And even when they are referred and accepted, they are promised a core worker that will work with them, and that's the last they hear of it. They never get that core worker. So it's almost like a house of cards. You know, you've got to get parts of the system, other parts of the system right to give support to children when they need it, so they don't grow up into frustrated, potentially offending adults. And until we start from the bottom up, I think this is just a self-fulfilling cycle, which is very worrying.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, we are quick with moral judgments about this. And I think what it always comes back to fundamentally is this isn't really about whether we like people or whether we agree with what people have done. It's a basic human right to access for physical and mental health. And obviously, if you had a prisoner who, I don't know, had a long-running physical issue that wasn't given access to physiotherapy or enough exercise, and that significantly worsened during the time in prison, that would be much more measurable, and it would be much more easy to identify the failures as they've gone along. But mental health is a bit trickier than that, isn't it?
It's not tricky, and I think because what we see often portrayed on TV in recreated documentaries are things about serial killers, let's say, for example. So clearly they do have mental health issues, but also it's very conflicting as an individual. Look, you know, X has killed 16 young women. You know, you don't really care whether they've got mental health issues. Lock them up and throw away the key because they're dangerous. So because that's what we're fed a diet of, that, like, you know, almost by way of osmosis, you know, goes into our brains, and therefore we feel that the mental health issues that people who offend in a much lesser way kind of go along with that. You know, they've done something bad, they need to be locked up. And I'd like to see more about people who do come out and do have a successful life and do have a positive experience from it, rather than this constant drip feed of, you know, the really seriously mentally ill, as much as, you know, serial killers, rapists, etc. Because we're getting just one slice of, or one version of, the kind of people that do offend and end in jail.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that we have as a society almost a kind of simultaneous fascination and abhorrence with people who behave outside of the sort of normal sphere of our understanding, don't we? That as you say, we watch these constant TV programs about what they did, why, but actually what's just going in is still quite a black and white idea of good and bad. And I think unfortunately, when we look at mental health provision in the justice system, we're still coming up against quite a lot of these very pejorative terms, aren't we, about bad, things, people have made mistakes. That language isn't really used.
It isn't, and we don't even see
or
it
bad.
in like crime dramas either.
No.
Anything, you do not see the part where you sometimes see them going to prison, and then you see them in another episode coming out, but we don't see, or we only see the bad stuff inside. We don't see the help that they might have been given. We just don't get a glimpse into it.
No.
So it's very skewed as to what we imagine life to be like, and it may well be like that, but if there is good stuff going on there, and there should be, to help people, it just isn't something, as you say, you get this quite voyeuristic black and white view into it.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's difficult to separate drama from real life, because they keep reconstructing some of the worst, serial criminals over and over again on BBC, on Netflix, or whatever it may be. And I just think that takes us further and further away from real life.
And from the sort of humanity of the situation, really, that these are human beings, women, people's mothers, sisters.
Indeed.
A lot of the women have children on the outside that they're not seeing, and there are some really heartbreaking backstories going on there, aren't there?
There are, and I think the trouble with the way it's presented to us in the media or on TV and broadcasting is that you've become inured to thinking about that, exactly what you say. That is someone's mother, sister, daughter. And it's, if we're not reminded of that in some way, we'll detach ourselves from that. And also it could be our mother, our daughter, our sister.
But for the grace of God go I.
And I think that's what people sort of feel, and they think it can't happen to them.
Yeah.
But actually, of course, it does, and it may do. And it's a deeper compassion is probably needed.
I think that's exactly right. I think the compassion and empathy, but the language around it, I think, is really important. People always say, well, that's just semantics, but that matters, doesn't it? It matters how we're talking about people, because it's indicative of our attitude as a society, isn't it? That if we view people as a series of errors and statistics, we're not really getting to the heart of where we need to be. In terms of then what might affect what effect prison has on somebody, what kind of experience, what effect would that have on somebody with no previous mental health issues, somebody who goes into the prison system? What do you think the lack of liberty and being sent away from family and friends, so for that sort of year, 2 years or whatever, what kind of impact do you think that has on people?
Look, it's obviously very tough for many people, but the truth is, generally human beings are quite resilient. We have a well of resilience, which we have shown during the pandemic, for example, that we don't always recognize we have, and also a degree of adaptability to our environment, to a change in circumstances that we couldn't have predicted and we have no control over. So there is that. However, on the flip side, you can almost step too far into the adaptability, too far into the resilience. So you do see people come out hardened, and they don't care whether they do it again. They've already done it once. They've come through. They're resentful. They're angry. They've seen some terrible things in there. They relish their freedom, but they're not. They've gone through it once, and you know what? They may reoffend and think, well, I might not get caught, or at least I've had that experience. So, there's a good side to resilience, and there's a bad side to resilience. And there's a threat of,
yes, sorry, but there's a danger as well, isn't there, of institutionalization as well? That
people coming out with views that you didn't go in with. People talk about, we hear about people being radicalized in prison, but that's not all that goes on. There are conversations, there are dialogues, there's pressure to be in a certain group, to be part of something that you may not have even considered that's detrimental to your future, and that you're coming out with some pretty distressing and probably disturbing messages in some cases, without having the impartiality of someone supporting you feel you can turn to and talk to, and they won't judge you and you won't feel pressure. You know, that balance for almost any offender is incredibly important.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jo, for talking to us. I really would encourage anybody who can to access The View, which is the magazine that Rebel Justice run. There are some really beautiful, there's some really beautiful artwork there from female prisoners, but there's also really quite heartbreaking stories. But I think, as you were saying, you know, the key thing here is humanizing people, and it's giving stories to what might otherwise be a series of statistics, so that we start to get an idea of who these women are, where they've come from, and what can improve outcomes for them post-release.
Absolutely.
And we've obviously got the Crowd Justice Fund. There's a court case going through at the moment with a lady called Miss L, who's been in and out of the prison system for, I think, 25 years, and has just not received the care and support that she needed. And things like that, they do start big conversations, don't they, about what is our criminal justice system for, how can it be
what it's like. 25
adapted.
years is such a long time, you know. I mean, that's a huge part of your life to be in and out. And it becomes, that's where institutionalization is almost becomes sort of addictive. You don't care, you want to go back. It's what you know, it's what you recognize. And we would be a very tragic place if we have people who actually feel greater security or a purpose when they're in the prison system than they do out of it. And that
says a lot about the connections and relationships and support they have on the outside as well, doesn't it?
It does.
That, you know, that becomes a safe space for them.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, well, thank you so much for talking to us, Jo. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Naomi.
You take care, and good luck with your new ITV documentary. I'll look out for that. All right. Cheers. Take care then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Is that okay? No, it's gone.
Yep. That was great. Thank you.